Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for coming. Gives me great pleasure to introduce Louisa Dunne. Louisa has been working for the British Council for over 16 years, and she's worked in countries like Nepal, Egypt, Portugal, Japan, and France. Currently, Louisa is our exams academic support manager, working in Paris and largely working with the IELTS exam. Louisa loves cycling all around Paris, and her other hobby is meeting new people. So for her, these last 3 days have been a real eye-opener, and she's really enjoyed meeting a lot of new people. And she's going to talk about...
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. I'm going to talk about some of the issues that we need to think about when trying to choose what sort of test to use, whether in a classroom or on a wider, sort of more high-stakes situation, and how the CEFR might be useful. And I'm going to try and show you one way that we've used it in Paris. Could I ask you possibly to come a bit nearer to the front, because I'm going to ask you to talk to each other at a couple of points in the presentation, and if you're all the way up at the back on your own, you're not going to have anyone to talk to. So if you don't mind, please move forward or make sure that you're sitting next to somebody that you'll be able to talk to. I think it's useful to divide tests into two different types of tests. We've got achievement tests, which are usually looking backwards, related to a specific course of study, often. Now, at the beginning of the course or at some point during the course, we might give our students a diagnostic progress test, which is to help us and the students to assess their strengths and weaknesses. I think the important thing when giving your students a diagnostic test is to try to avoid giving them a grade. It would be so much better if we could give them advice, explanations of the things that they didn't understand, and sources that they can use to improve in their weaker areas. So progress tests usually, in an ideal situation, are formative and help the students to know where they are and where they still need to go while on a course of study. Obviously, at the end of a course of study, we'll have a summative achievement test to see what they have and haven't learnt. On the other hand, we've got proficiency tests, which are often high-stakes commercial tests, which are not related to any specific course of study. They might measure general language proficiency, or they might measure language proficiency for a specific context, such as academic English, medical English. Because proficiency tests look to the future, by testing the students, we're trying to predict what the students will be able to do in the domain in the future on the basis of what we can see that they know. And for this reason, it's very important with proficiency tests that the sample which is tested, we have to get it right. I'd also like to just briefly talk about the difference between direct and indirect testing. Direct testing is when we ask a candidate to display a skill or ability in a way that reflects how that ability would be demonstrated in the real world. And it's now generally accepted that direct testing is the best way to assess the productive skills. One example of direct testing is the IELTS test, particularly the academic module of IELTS, which is now used across the world for entrance to university-level studies in English. The IELTS academic writing tasks are so well respected, I think, because they are a representation of the types of tasks that students in university will have to do, either describing the data in a written format or writing academic essays. And this means that the inferences that are drawn from the test about students' future performance at university tend to be accurate. And there has been some research into this which has shown a significant correlation between higher IELTS scores and higher grade point averages for students once they're in university. To go on to indirect testing, when we're testing the receptive skills of listening and reading, we can only test these indirectly. We try to break down the skills into the separate components and then make generalizations about the candidate or test taker's receptive skills on the basis of that. Because if we're testing, for example, listening, we're either going to be testing listening with writing, or listening with speaking, or listening with reading and writing. So for the receptive skills, the only possibility is indirect testing. I'd now like you to talk to somebody next to you and talk to them about the types of tests that you either have to create or that you have to use. Are these achievement tests or proficiency tests? Are they related to a specific course of study or not? Are they evaluating students' general language proficiency or specific language proficiency for a particular domain, such as academic English? And are they formative or are they summative? Are they formative in terms of a learning tool for the students, or are they an evaluation of what they've learned? It's quite possible that you create and use all of these. Could you just talk to the person next to you for a couple of minutes and tell them what sort of tests you use? Could I stop you there? We will be doing questions and comments at the end, so if you've got something that you'd like to say, you'll have your opportunity to do so in a little while. I think when thinking about what sort of test to use or to create, there are, of course, both the needs of the organization or the institution and also the needs and aims of the learners that we need to think about. And when I started trying to think about this, I realized that although they're looking at it perhaps from different angles, they're very similar. For example, if we look at the level, the institution needs to know the test taker's level, but also the test takers or the students themselves need and want to know what their level is. In the case of progress, if we're testing to see what progress has been made, obviously the institution is trying to evaluate the teaching and learning process and perhaps make syllabus decisions based on the results of the test, whereas for the learners themselves, they want to see that they are making progress. In terms of linguistic aims, I think the key question is to ask, what do these test takers, what will they need to do with the language in real life? And that's the same at an organizational level. When we're making decisions about tests, we need to think about that, and I think that's going to be a key aim for the learners. Obviously, there are issues to do with the test takers' characteristics which need to be taken into account, whether their age, gender, social and educational background, and what motivates them. And finally, I think we all have to think about resources. Again, in terms of an institution setting a test, how practical is it? What kind of logistical considerations are there if it's a test which is going to be used across the whole of a huge country like India? How is that going to be managed? And of course the cost. Whereas in terms of resources for the learners, it's thinking about what kind of access do they have to learning resources, how much time do they have to give to studying the language, and in the case of the use of a commercial high-stakes test, how much money have they got? Although many of you may not at the moment be concerned with this, there may come a point when you're asked to choose a commercially available test, maybe for your institution, or perhaps students coming and asking you which test they should take. And I think the key issues to think about here when choosing a commercially available test are these. Is the test going to have positive washback in terms of the language ability being developed by the students in the preparation for the test? Obviously, skills tests do have a positive washback because in preparing for a skills test, the students improve their language skills. Multiple choice tests have a washback, perhaps in developing the skill of dealing with multiple choice tests, but how useful that is in real life is debatable. The next issue, I think, to think about, the question you should ask yourself is how widely is the test organized? Because in Europe, we have students who are choosing to study in another European country or applying for universities, in fact, all over the world now, or applying for Erasmus programs. So if they have to do a test, it's best that they do one that's widely recognized by a number of institutions so that they don't have to do two separate tests. Obviously, absolutely key to a good test are issues around validity and reliability. As teachers, we can't assess that for ourselves, but any commercially available test will have research which is publicly available. I know with IELTS, because I work with IELTS, that there are IELTS research reports which you can download from the website, and make sure that any commercial test, that the reliability studies and the validity studies have been done and are significant. And the fourth issue, I suppose, is the availability of the test. Where can you take it? For example, from talking to my colleague Devi, I know that here in India you have a situation quite like we have in France, where you're offering the IELTS test all over the country. In fact, there are 38 centres across India and one in Bhutan, I've been told, with the test being available 4 dates a month. So if you're recommending a test to your students, make sure that they're not going to have to travel miles and miles to take the test, and that it is available, because certainly with university applications, it's often quite a tight deadline. Going back more generally to when you're creating a test for yourself and for your students, the main thing that you need to do before you start is define the purpose of the test. What are you trying to find out? I want to give you an example from a number of years ago when my son was studying in an English medium school in Nepal. And I won't mention the name of the school. I'll say it was a very good English medium school. And he had his English test. So I was like, oh, don't worry, you speak English. You won't have any problem with the English test, darling. So he went for his first English test in his school. And he came home and he said, but Mum, I didn't remember the name of the third son of the farmer in the second story in the book. I said, well, that doesn't matter, does it? No. And he said, oh, I didn't remember the exact wording of what the farmer said to his wife. I know he told his wife that they couldn't do it for this reason and that reason, but I couldn't remember the exact wording. And I was like, no, that's not a problem. So anyway, when he got his results for his English test, he was quite worried because the test, in fact, was not a test of English. It was a test of whether or not the students had committed to memory the book that they had been reading in the English lessons. And although he remembered the story, he didn't remember the actual words. And I think it's very easy, if you don't think about what you want to find out and why you're testing, people can end up setting a test which actually isn't testing English, but is just testing, memorization. And I don't think that tells us very much that's useful about what our students can do in English. So once you've decided what you want to find out, then you've got to think about which type of test is best suited to this, and be very careful that you are testing what you think you're testing. That if you're testing a skill, for example, if you're doing direct testing for productive skills, that's easier. If you're doing indirect testing, think very, very carefully, what am I asking my students to do here, and is it actually relevant to what I'm trying to find out? I'll give you a very quick couple of examples. I'm not going to go into all the skills because I don't think I've got time, and I know you all want to get away for lunch at 1 o'clock. But for example, if you're setting a reading test, these are some of the issues that you should be thinking about. Background knowledge. How much background knowledge will the test takers or the students need in order to fully comprehend that text? Because most texts have a context, and there's an element of background knowledge which has been proved to make a huge difference. We want to avoid favoring one student over another because of their background knowledge if the aim of our test is to find out how good their English is. So it might be a better idea to try to set questions which demonstrate adequate understanding at a linguistic level rather than complete understanding, which will inevitably be affected by the degree of background knowledge that the students have. Authenticity is my next point. If you can use a text that the learners will actually have to deal with in real life, that's going to be much more useful to them. And again, the washback from it is they're becoming more familiar with the types of texts that they're going to have to deal with. There's also, to avoid being stuck and, a certain type of text, it's best to try and have a variety of different types, and whenever possible, try to make sure that the text that you use is unfamiliar to the test takers, because if they've seen it before, you're not testing their language ability, and it's not fair if only some of them have seen it before. It's also, with reading, we need to think about the reading skills that the students are going to need to use to complete the tasks. So if this test asks for students to use, for example, skimming and scanning skills, we need to think, well, have we taught those to the students? Do they know the reading skills that they'll need to do the test? If not, that's our job to make sure that they do. Obviously, the quantity of text and the level of the text needs to be appropriate to the student's age and level, and the type of tasks that you set are absolutely key. I'm going back to my least favorite type of task, multiple choice questions, which is a skill in itself, but I mean, be careful with them, use them judiciously, I think. Any kind of task, whether it's short answer questions, then you're also testing writing. So you've got to think about, am I going to take into account the features of writing? Am I going to insist on correct spelling, correct grammar, correct pronunciation, or am I testing reading, in which case, if they've shown that they've read and understood, do they get the mark? This is what you need to decide as the person setting the test. And whatever kind of task you're setting, it's only fair to the students that they're familiar with the format. So I would strongly urge you to make a practice test, do the practice test with the students before they do the actual test, because otherwise they may not do as well as you expect, not because they can't read in English, but because the format's unfamiliar. Again, with speaking, there are issues in the teaching and learning of speaking which impact directly on the testing of speaking. The key one of these is planning time, which has been proved to make a great difference to our performance. If we have time to plan before we speak in a foreign language, we will do it much better. So if you're designing speaking tasks to use with your classes, remember to factor in time for the students to assimilate the information before they have to speak. Obviously, speaking tests have huge practical considerations. The time involved when you've got lots of students, it's very difficult to manage. And always bear in mind that a speaking test is very different from a conversation, because any conversation that we have has a time and place setting and has a context and has a purpose, whereas in a speaking test, you've got the power relationship between the examiner or the teacher and the student, and it's quite difficult. I mean, you can create a time and place setting and a purpose, but you need to think consciously about that. You need to make a decision on how much of an impact their accent or pronunciation is going to have on how you grade them. And that, again, is your decision. If you're trying to set a speaking test for lower level students, they're probably going to need some content support, some ideas of the things they can talk about, because we're trying to reduce the cognitive load for lower level learners, because already it's quite a struggle for them to speak in a foreign language. So try to give them some ideas to talk about. And the final issue with testing speaking is it's very, very difficult to predict what response you're going to get. So, I mean, there's a whole debate about whether or not you can predict this and to what extent, but I shan't go into it now. I'm now going to talk a little bit about the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. First, to give you, I'm sure you know quite a lot about it, and in your bags you will have received this leaflet which gives a bit more information about it. Just to tell you a bit about the background, before we had the CEFR, we had no way to compare the performance of people following different language courses or the performance of people taking different language tests. And with the increased international mobility that we have nowadays, which is continually increasing, institutions across the world need some way to compare the language performance of people from different backgrounds who are perhaps coming into universities to study in other countries. So the CEFR is not the solution, but it's helping. It was developed between 1989 and 1996 by the Council of Europe, and it basically provides for mutual recognition of language levels and qualifications, which therefore helps with both educational and occupational mobility. It tries to describe in a comprehensive way what language learners have to learn to use language for communication, the knowledge and skills that they need to develop. This allows everybody who's involved in language learning, from the highest levels at the ministry, down through teacher educators, teachers, and down to the students, to, well, it allows the teachers and everybody else to reflect on current practice and ensure that they are meeting their students' needs. And it allows the students to be more aware of where they are in their language learning. This means they can set for themselves realistic aims, and so they can take control of their own learning. So the CEFR is a practical tool. It is vague and it is incomplete because it has to work for all languages, and there are currently, I think, 30 languages which are involved with the CEFR. And the authors of the CEFR, including Cost, North and Trim, very deliberately kept it vague. It's useful, obviously, for educational and professional mobility because it gives us a common language to talk about language ability. But the key thing is to remember that it's not a CEF, it's not a framework, it's a CEFR, which means it's a framework of reference. It's not intended to be a prescriptive tool. It's not intended to impose standardized solutions. It was designed as a tool for reflection, communication, and empowerment, and it's still evolving. It's not fixed. That's what it is, and this is what it isn't. It's a tool for reflection, communications, and empowerment, as described by John Trim. So it's not a detailed description of language, and it's not a kite mark. It's not associated with any official body which checks how language tests have been mapped to it. So it's actually, it's the responsibility of language testers or teachers to map their own tests or courses to the CEFR, not the other way around. And these mappings do change and do evolve as the whole framework itself is still changing and evolving as people are using it. It's not a very good way even to compare different types of tests, because although two tests might be at the same level, as I said at the beginning, they might be very different tests, and the fact that they're at the same level doesn't mean that they are equivalent in any way. One might have very positive washback and one might have less so. So it's people around the world are mapping courses and tests to the CEFR, but it's not a guarantee of quality. The key thing you need to look at is how well constructed the test is. Just to give you the overview of the CEFR, going from A1, the basic user, up to C2, the proficient user, I just wanted to say, you'll notice here that there are no discrete cut-off points between the levels, because learning a language, we don't jump from one level to the next. It's a continuum, and the CEFR takes that into account. And so we need to use it flexibly and use our own judgment, because, again, it's a framework for reference. Relating exams to the CEFR. could I ask you again to talk to the person next to you about what could be the advantage of relating language exams to the CEFR? So a couple of minutes there, just talk to people around you about what you think might be the advantage of relating language exams to this framework of reference. So again, if you want to comment on that, you'll have time at the end. The authors of the CEFR understood that there's no single way to map a test to the CEFR, and that different exam boards will use different methodologies to assess language ability. They do, however, provide a set of suggested procedures for mapping the tests to it, and it includes familiarization, specification, standardization, standard setting, and validation. I know, for example, with IELTS, when the IELTS test was mapped to the CEFR, they actually used all of the suggested methods to do it. If you are interested in mapping any test or exam to the CEFR, there is a manual which is available. It's on the internet, and I'll have the link at the end of the presentation, which sets out guidelines about how you can do this. But in order to do it, it does take time, because there has to be an initial mapping exercise, and then you have to do some research to check that you've got it right. And what's happened, certainly with the sort of high stakes tests, is that they not continually, but they have adjusted the mapping of the tests once they've got more evidence to try and be as accurate as possible with it. I'm now going to talk about how it's been useful, particularly in the European context, where I've been working for the last 7 or 8 years now. It's been helpful, certainly in terms of student mobility. It's made it possible for students to go abroad and study parts of their course, or perhaps their whole course, at a university in another country. It's helped with international recognition of courses in universities and even in language schools. It's helped to improve the academic standardization within an institution, because all teachers can have a shared vision of where the students are in their language learning, or where they need to be. It's also helped standardization across institutions. For example, in France now, in the French engineering schools, a decision has been taken at the ministry level that in order to graduate as an engineer in France, the students need to have a B2 level of English. It's also helped with teaching and learning, because it's allowed us to set clearer learning objectives which are more transparent. These we can communicate to the learners so they can see where they are, where they want to be or need to be with their language learning, and also learn to learn and develop their own autonomy as learners. I'd now like to show you how you can use the CEFR in a very simple way. That's something that we did in Paris, to first of all to set course objectives. Now, I believe some people have some handouts. Could I ask you to give those out for me, please?
Many things have been touched upon in your presentation. Do you think that at some point of time, the tester for spoken English would also need a little bit of training? that is, just a minute, a tester to test speaking skills, for example, would perhaps, in a larger context, when we particularly come into a teacher training context, more than the CEFR context, but in general, my perception would be that a tester perhaps would also require a certain training.
You're talking about training for teachers in order to set the test.
Not just set the test, but if we are talking about testing speaking.
Yes.
Good. Now, I can teach speaking, but if having done the teaching speaking, if I want to test speaking, would I, as a tester, that is, from my role as a teacher then, and now my role as a tester, would I need a little bit of maybe an ear training or test construction or test administration?
Ideally,
Yeah.
I think, yes, it would be useful. I think as a teacher, you have the skills to assess your students speaking.
Yeah.
But certainly if there was any kind of national speaking test which was used, I would be strongly in favour of there being very clear instructions. There would need to be criteria which were clear to the teachers of how they were to assess the students. And yes, ideally, if it's a high stakes test, then there needs to be some kind of training and standardization of teachers to make sure that the test is fair.
Absolutely.
And that it's implemented in the same way. I'm going to go on a bit and I'll take any other questions at the end, but thank you very much for that. You have hopefully in front of you an example of a handout. If there aren't enough, I've tried to copy it up onto the slide. So this is what we did. We took some of the CEFR B2 writing descriptors, which you can see here, and we used them in a lot of different ways. The smiley faces represent how well the student can do these things. Now, this might be the teacher who would decide this, or ideally, at the beginning of the course, the students would be asked to think about these and decide how confident they feel. So can they write letters and emails in an appropriate style for work and travel with difficulty, with some difficulty, with less difficulty, or almost effortlessly? What we did is we took these descriptors and used them to set the course aims for the course, for the writing part. So if you have the handout in front of you, you should be able to see that we didn't really change it, but we wrote it in a way that this is what you're going to learn on this course. You're going to learn to write essays giving reasons for and against. You're going to learn to justify your opinions in letters, emails, and essays. You're going to write letters and emails in an appropriate style for work and travel. So it makes the learning quite clear, because it helps us in a lot of ways. First of all, we set clear objectives for the students. We ask the students to assess themselves against these. How confident do they feel at the beginning? We use it during the course. I mean, you can come back to the same document 2 or 3 times during the course to say to the students, okay, look again at that. We've just been looking at letters and emails for work. Do you feel that you've moved up the scale? Do you feel more confident about doing this? We've also used it as the basis of counselling sessions with students halfway through the course, sitting with the same document and saying, you know, you seem to be doing very well with this, but you're still having problems here, and I want to see you moving up the smiley faces until you feel that you are really confident with this. And finally, we use it again to set either progress and end of course tests, because this is what we've said you're going to learn. Then we've looked at it, this is where you're going, and at the end, we're trying to see if the students have learned it or not. I'd like you to keep those in front of you and just look. I've got up here on the slide, for the descriptors that are there in front of you, which of these tests do you think would be better and why? You can talk to each other or you can think about it on your own. I'll give you 1 or 2 minutes. The purpose of the test is to see whether or not the students who were teaching the course which is outlined, who were on the course outlined by the handout. I'll go back to those. So these were the course objectives: writing essays, giving reasons for and against, justifying opinions, speculating about the future in written English, taking notes during a talk or lecture in English, writing letters and emails in an appropriate style for work and travel, and writing essays, articles, and descriptions of personal experience. These are some of the descriptors from B2 writing on the CEFR. So we set that as the course aim. And now I'm just asking you, which of these tests do you think would be a better test for the end of that course? I'll do it on a show of hands. The first one, I was thinking about something like this, a multiple choice test of grammar and vocabulary. Would anyone like to vote for number 1? Okay. Anyone like to vote for number 2, a gapped letter? Anyone like to vote for number 3? Now, this is an essay that the students have already written in the class. Who would vote for number 4? Thank you. And number 5, a dictation. We didn't set out to teach our students dictation. We set out to teach them to write essays. So number 4 is the one that I was hoping most of you would go for. Just if you want to read up a bit more about this, there's some very interesting research papers in language teaching and learning from Greece, which are currently, it's free to download on there's a special issue on language testing and assessment issues, free to download on the internet. You've got the link for that. If you want to find out more about the Common European Framework of Reference, you've got the link there to it, and you can find it very easily on the internet. And a favorite book of mine is Tim McNamara's Language Testing, which is published by OUP, if you're looking for something to read. I'd like to take questions now, if anyone has any questions or comments.
Okay, we have one question here. Anyone else want to ask a question? So we'll just... Okay, or a comment.
Thank you very much. That was very enlightening. I mean, you are an experienced test maker and you have done a lot of work in this. I want a rationale for a situation that we have in India right now. The Central Board of Examinations has shifted from subjective answers to multiple choice questions, and I personally don't think that's a very nice way of testing language or literature. I want to see if you can find a rationale for the shift that has happened. Because I personally, I mean, maybe a few colleagues of mine will agree that that isn't the ideal way of testing language, but there has been a total shift from the subjective to the objective, and it's very irritating.
I think this is one of those decisions. I totally agree with you that from I personally don't like multiple choice questions either. I don't think it's a very good way of testing, or you have to be very careful with them. I can imagine why they've done it, probably because of practical logistic issues, because multiple choice questions as tests are so popular because they're so easy to administer and so easy to mark. But I mean, I would certainly say that, you know, it would be worth advocating for direct testing, because direct testing is generally accepted by all of the testing experts to be really the only valid way of testing productive skills. So if this is, I mean, it's reading, it's arguable, but reading and writing, presumably. But I imagine it's for practical and cost-effective issues that's happened. But I think that, you know, if as teachers you think that that's not a good decision, I think you should lobby and make your voices heard, because you know best what the students need. And, you know, good luck with that.
Okay, we have a question here from the gentleman on, yeah, thank you.
Actually, it is not a question, just I want to share my opinion that the lady, she pointed out the recent multiple choice questions, but it is not the fact. In CCE, we have a partial, like 50% of reading and writing section. In that, we have multiple choice questions to some extent, not completely. So it is not true that it has the defects. Even there is a scope for subjective analysis.
Thank you for that comment. I don't want us to get into a debate now about the format of the test, but let's talk about it afterwards. Has anyone else got any questions or comments?
Good afternoon, ma'am. Actually, I'm just going to draw your attention towards the direct and indirect testing. There is a question in my mind that direct testing is generally the best way to assess productive skills, speaking and writing, no doubt.
Yes.
But I'm thinking that the institutions we are working in, we have to just go with those type of students having some disabilities, like the hearing disability. So how those type of students can be helped in such type of testing? So please clear me. And regarding indirect, unavoidable, there is a word, unavoidable, when testing receptive skills, listening and reading. Even those hearing impaired students who are just along with us going in classes, how will just apply indirect testing to those type of students if they have no capability to listen clearly? So I'm sorry to draw your attention towards such type of questions. Okay.
No, thank you for that question. I think it's a really important issue. I know with high-stakes tests or commercially available tests which are produced by Cambridge ESOL, including the Cambridge Main Suite tests and the IELTS test, if a candidate is not able to hear properly, they do make special arrangements. You cannot set a listening test for a student who cannot hear properly. They have to be given the listening text to read, and that's what happens with large exams. In terms of speaking, people who have problems hearing sometimes have problems articulating and with pronunciation, and I personally would say that in that case, you who are setting and marking the test have to take that into consideration and not mark as you would an accent, if that is an accent which is the result of somebody's personal, you know, situation. Thank you very much for raising that.
Ma'am, very correct as seconding her. CBSE nowadays had divided the question paper, reading, writing, grammar, testing, all the skills, thus killing the language. Killing the language in the sense, if you give a discursive essay, the bomb and the Buddha, they won't be able to write anything. The multiple choice has paralyzed the way of writing. Can you suggest some measures where we can literally cultivate the style of writing as it used to be in order to get, to serve the purpose, know the language, which is very necessary. Multiple choice only, very easy to correct. How much did students achieve is the question mark.
No, I mean, yes, I agree with you. And also in terms of if we're trying to think about our learners' needs and teach them skills that they need for the real world, they need to be able to write. In terms of helping with that, I think in your class you can still teach essay writing, and I mean, you can start from a model, or I personally prefer working with samples of students writing, because I think if we provide the students with a model that we've written, the difference in level or between what we write and what they can write may actually have a negative impact on their own feelings about what they can write. So what I try to do is ask students, if they write a good essay, I say, would you mind if I kept your essay, maybe, you know, copied it and used it with my other classes to show them that students of their age or their level, look how good these things can do. And it has a wonderful impact on the motivation of the students, because the student feels valued and the other students, there's not such a difference between what the good student in the class can write and every other student as there is between what the teacher can write and what the student can write.
Ma'am, just a second.
I'm sorry, we only have time, we only have about 2 more minutes.
Half a second.
So
linguistically controlled writing, that is what CBSE is sticking to. Linguistically controlled writing. Everything has to be within 50 words or 20 words or 30 words. Doesn't actually serve the purpose. Any measures to adapt and improvise. That's all. Later on you can answer if it's not now. Thank you, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. I'll answer that later.
Okay. We have just time for 2 more questions. We have a gentleman on here and then one person in the front row here. Okay.
Very recently, we had a massive public examination to test teachers' eligibility or proficiency throughout the country for appointments. It's known as TET, Teachers Eligibility Test. And these tests were organized with the multiple choice formats, testing all the, you know, variety of pedagogic and non-pedagogic issues using multiple choice. Now, considering your views on multiple choice questions, how would you see this whole system of testing, the concept of validity of this kind of an exercise, testing teachers' proficiency for appointment through the multiple choice system?
Is it a test of their language, or is it a test of their knowledge of the methodology and the language?
Everything, pedagogy, various concepts of their subjects, so on and so forth.
I hope that whoever made that test did the research. I'm not saying that a multiple choice test can't be valid, but it does have a tendency to be potentially less valid, and I can only hope that the research was done in the piloting stage to ensure that that test was valid and was reliable, because it sounds like a hugely important test.
Okay, one last question. And other questions, Louisa will be around here for lunch, over lunch, so you're very welcome to come and speak to her.
Yeah, it's just very short question. Taking into account the negative aspects of large classrooms, to what extent do you think multiple choice questions or tests are applicable in such classrooms?
I think I can sympathize with you if you are a teacher who's working. I've worked myself in a private school in Nepal a number of years ago, and I remember having over 80 students in each class. We've got to balance issues of practicality with issues of what's the best test to set. I think for progress tests, multiple choice questions and multiple choice question-based tests can be useful as long as they're used to show the students what they've learned, what they're still not sure about. I'm less comfortable personally with the testing of productive skills through multiple choice questions. But, you know, as the teacher, you know if you've got 8 classes of 80 students and you haven't got time to read and mark an essay for every one of those students, you may have to make compromises, you know, to take into account the situation in which you're working. But certainly if it's a more important test, if it's being used to make decisions about students, I would be very wary of multiple choice.
I'd like to just take this opportunity to thank Louisa, who's come all the way from France just for this, and I think she's still a little bit jet-lagged, but thank you for a very interesting and stimulating presentation. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. It's been lovely, and please do come and talk to me if you have questions.